what it means to fear God. So what is the fear of the Lord? All right, so would you go ahead and, the first verse I want to look at is in Isaiah chapter 8. If you want to turn over there, it's Isaiah chapter 8. And actually, they're going to put it up on the screen. Do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. So do not say a conspiracy concerning all the things that this people call a conspiracy. And, you know, if you guys listen to my live stream on Tuesday nights, I've talked about this a little bit, how people, they just get their focus on all the stuff that's going on in the world. They get their focus on what's going on in politics, what's going on in the news, what's the chaos going on outside. And you get to focusing on all that stuff, and it's easy to take your focus off of God. And it's easy for you to get afraid, honestly. When you start seeing all the crazy stuff going on in the world, and it's easy to let fear kind of take over. And he's saying, don't focus on that stuff. Don't worry about those conspiracies. Don't worry about those problems, those troubles, those things that are going on outside. He said, keep your focus on God, and let God be your fear, and let God be your dread. And when you hear the word fear and dread, you hear your fear of God. I think a lot of people probably have all kinds of stuff going on in their head, thinking, what does that mean? What does it mean to fear God? What does it mean to be afraid of him? And, if you probably heard some of the same things that I've heard, where people say, well, the fear of God doesn't actually mean fear God. Have you ever heard somebody say that? I have. I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say that. Well, to fear God doesn't mean you actually fear him. Really, what's it mean? Because as I've studied through the scriptures on this topic, every single time it means fear. Yeah, you look up the word in the concordance, and it says to fear or to reverence. And so people say, well, when it's talking about God, it means to reverence him. And that just means you kind of highly esteem him, you revere him. And yeah, there is a connotation that it does mean reverence. I agree. But it also means fear. It means to be terrified and to dread and to tremble. And you see these words being used. It says that they feared greatly and trembled before him. And so there's this sense that we are to have actual fear of God, not just revere him and think highly of him. Okay? Have you ever heard people refer to someone as a God-fearing man? It used to be a common thing. It used to be when someone was a believing, devoted, devout Christian, someone who walked the right way, they would say he's a God-fearing man, right? And I was thinking about that as I was putting this together, and I thought, it's been a really long time since I've heard people use that phrase. And it used to be a common thing. It used to be a common thing for somebody to say, are you a God-fearing man? He's a God-fearing man. But you don't hear that anymore. Now it's, he's saved. He's a believer. He's a Christian. Right? Like the fear of God is kind of absent or left out. Like it's not that important anymore. In the Bible, we see a God-fearing man or God-fearer. It meant the same thing. And so it was somebody who was devoted, religious, devout worshiper of God. It's the equivalent of someone who is, if you're a God-fearer, you are a God worshiper, is the way it's kind of used in the scriptures, right? And so we see Cornelius in Acts 10 is described this way. It says, Acts 10 verses 1 and 2. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment, a devout man, and one who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. So this idea that someone is a God-fearing man means that they are devout, they They follow God. They wholeheartedly serve Him, worship Him. And interestingly, the first mention of someone having this fear of God, that God spoke to someone and said, I wanted to see if you feared me, is in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. This is obviously God talking to Abraham, right? So God speaks to Abraham. He says, I'm going to give you a son. Abraham's pushing 100 in his age. His wife is roughly 90. They're old. They're beyond the age of childbearing. And God says, you're going to have a son. And after a series of things that happen, Sarah gives birth to a son. And then God tells Abraham, I want you to take your son up to the mountain. I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. And can you imagine Abraham at that moment? But you know what he did? The very next morning, like immediately, the next day, he gets up, grabs Isaac, grabs some wood, and starts walking up the mountain. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wrestle with it. He just said, okay, God. And he went and did it. And God said, I wanted to see if you feared me. God didn't let him sacrifice Isaac. He said, I was checking to see if you feared me. Have you ever thought about that? How significant that is in the life of Abraham and in the life of all of the people in the Bible since. And you hear people say things like, well, God's been working on me with this issue in my life for a few weeks now or a few months now. We've been working this out. He's been trying to talk to me about this. And you ever hear that? And it's like with Abraham, God said, do this, and he just went and did it immediately. He wasn't wrestling about it. There wasn't hesitation. There wasn't, well, I don't know if I can do that or not. He just immediately, God said do it, so I'm going to do it. Why? Because he feared God. What the Bible says. That's what God said. Now I know that you fear God. And so Abraham feared God so much that he was willing to lay down his own son. And, his son was, this was like his lifelong dream. He'd wanted a son his whole life. His son was his heritage, his lineage. Everything was going to go to his son. Not only that, this was the promise that God gave him. And he was willing to lay it all down because God said so. And then, you think there's things in our life that God says, lay that down. And it's not even nearly as significant as what Abraham laid down. And we're like, I don't know if I can do that, God. Really? Is it that important? Do you fear God? Abraham was considered the father of our faith. And I believe this is why. Because it says he believed God and he obeyed God. Why? Because he feared God. They're all linked together. Belief, obedience, and fear. They're tied together. The reason he obeyed is because he feared. The reason he believed is because he feared. The reason he obeyed is because he believed. They're all intermingled, right? So like I said, I've heard people try to downplay the word fear, and they say that it doesn't mean you actually need to fear God. They say, it doesn't mean you actually have to fear him. Just, you just need to show him respect, reverence. The next part is, hallowed be your name. What does it mean to hallow? This is tied in with fear. Okay? When you hallow him, you are highly exalting him. You are saying, you are holy, you are set apart. You are good, and I am not. You are holy, I am not. Your name is highly exalted and worthy, and I am not. This is tied in with fear. Okay? This is how you show fear to God, is by hallowing him. It's that type of reverence, like they said. It's showing reverence for him. I'm not saying there's not. I agree completely that yes, fearing God has to do with showing reverence to him. But it's more than that. It's not just reverence. But so you hallow his name. When you approach him in prayer, Yeshua said to approach him this way. Hallowed be your name. You approach him humbly, and you approach him in fear. Okay? Knowing that he is God. He is all-powerful. He is almighty. And who are we? Who am I to stand in God's presence? And so whenever I hear people approach God in disrespectful ways, whether they're being silly and goofy, or whether they're being demanding and somehow think that they own God, both of those anger me and bother me greatly. I've been around people when they joke about things in prayer and kind of make it silly. That very much offends me, because God deserves your respect. And when people are very demanding of him and say, God, you need to do this because, and they're kind of trying to command God around, that angers me because they're not showing him respect. He is God and you are not. You approach him as a servant. You approach him as a child. He's not your slave. He's your maker. And you need to give him that honor, give him that fear, that reverence that he is due. I want to look at Hosea chapter 11, verses 10 and 11. It says, they shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his sons shall come trembling from the west. His sons come trembling. You notice that? He didn't say his enemies are going to tremble. He says his sons will tremble. Okay? This is significant. It shows us that even the sons of God tremble in his presence. Okay? He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his sons will come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt, like a dove from the land of Assyria, and I will let them dwell in their houses, says the Lord. Can you imagine standing near a lion when it roars? Have you ever heard that? Can you imagine hearing him speak? When, like at Mount Sinai, when it says that the thunderings and the lightning and the roar and the rumble and the trumpets blast, it said the people were terrified. He's a lion. And so many times we have in our mind, we want God to be safe. We want a safe God. Take out his teeth, remove his claws, put a muzzle on him, make him a little teddy bear you can kind of snuggle with. We want a safe God that we can just kind of cuddle with and be happy and feel at peace, right? We want a lion. We want to have a lion, but we want him to be safe. It's kind of the way people act. And they act like they want a pet, I want this pet that I can feel safe around. He'll protect me, but he's not a danger to me. He's a pet. Kind of the way we treat him sometimes, I think. That's not who God is. God is not a pet. He is not someone that you can own, that you can boss around. And he's quite dangerous. He is dangerous, but he's good. Okay? So when we talk about the fear of God, we have to understand who we're talking about. This is the one who spoke, let there be light, and there was light. He didn't even have to get his hands dirty. He didn't break a sweat. He just said the word, let there be. And there was. He is all-powerful. He's the one who sent the plagues in Egypt. Right? Went through Egypt slaying the firstborn children of all of Egypt because they didn't fear God. He's the one that caused the desert to swallow up Korah and his rebellion. He's also the one that parted the Red Sea and then crashed the Red Sea in on the Egyptians. He's quite capable of destroying whoever and whatever he wants. Quite capable. And he showed himself to do that. And so is he safe? No. But he's good. So, I think it's interesting, though, because I think most people are probably more afraid of Satan than they are of God. Have you ever thought about that? People are more afraid of Satan and demons than they are of God. Why? Why would you be afraid of him? When you fear God, you don't need to fear him. When you fear God, you don't need to fear Satan. You realize that? Because when you fear God, you are close to him. He is on your side. You have no reason to fear anything else or anyone else. This is what the fear of God does in you. Because when you fear God, you realize you don't need to fear anyone else. There's no other room for fear. What does the Bible say? It says perfect love casts out all fear, right? Because the love of God is the fear of God. They're connected. And that love of God, that fear of God, drives out all other fears. You don't need to be afraid of men. You don't need to be afraid of demons. Because you have the fear of the Lord in your life. And so people who are afraid of what the world might do to them, what the government might do to them, what their boss might do to them, what their whoever might do to them. They're afraid of what the devil might do to them, what the Antichrist might do to them. And you have all those kinds of fears. What that tells me is you don't fear God properly. If you're fearing all these other things, that means you're not fearing God the way you should.